Let us be frank. For art history, when stripped of its velvet ropes and hushed gallery tones, is a blood sport of ideas, and its subjects are not saints in gilded frames, but men and women of flesh, ambition, and profound, often terrifying complexity. The figure of Albrecht Dürer, as he has been handed down to us, is perhaps the most immaculately crafted icon in the Western canon. We see the pious, divinely gifted German master, the colossus of the Northern Renaissance who, with the force of his will and the unparalleled precision of his burin, elevated the humble print to the empyrean heights of fine art. We see the humanist scholar, the friend of emperors and intellectuals, the handsome, thoughtful face that gazes out from a series of self-portraits so revolutionary they still have the power to arrest our gaze 5 centuries later. This is the Durer of record, the brand AD so brilliantly marketed that it became synonymous with German genius itself. He was, in every sense, the architect of his own immortality. And he would despise you for knowing that the foundations of this grand edifice were built upon shifting sands of private misery, gnawing anxiety and a vanity so profound it bordered on the messianic. He would detest the prying eyes that seek to look beyond the masterful cross-hatching and into the shadows of his own soul, for it is in those shadows that the real man lived, breathed, and suffered. To understand Albrecht Dürer, we must be willing to commit a form of historical sacrilege. We must pull back the curtain he so carefully drew, not as an act of posthumous vandalism, but as an act of reclamation. For in finding the tormented, anxious, proud, and often deeply unhappy man behind the monogram, we do not diminish his genius, we find its source. We discover a figure far more compelling, more tragic, and ultimately more human than the plaster saint of popular acclaim. This is not an exercise in tearing down an idol, but an invitation to understand the crushing weight he had to bear in order to become one. Forget the legend for a moment. Let us go in search of the man. Our uncomfortable journey begins where all true human drama resides, in the home. For 34 years, from 1494 until his death in 1528, Durer was married to Agnes Fry. On the surface, it was a good match, a strategic union typical of the age. He was a gifted artist, the son of a respectable goldsmith, and she was the daughter of a coppersmith and lute maker from a well-regarded family. The marriage brought with it a significant dowry of 200 florins, a welcome injection of capital for the ambitious young artist. It was a contract, a social and economic merger designed to solidify status and facilitate prosperity. Love, as we conceive of it, was not a prerequisite. It was a potential and often unlikely byproduct. For Durer, it seems to have remained entirely absent. Our most vivid and admittedly most venomous account of the Durer marriage comes from the pen of his lifelong friend, the erudite, wealthy, and powerfully connected humanist, Willibald Pirkheimer. Pirkheimer was everything Durer aspired to be in social standing: a patrician, a scholar fluent in Greek and Latin, a man who moved in the highest circles of Nuremberg society. His loyalty to Durer was immense, and his contempt for Agnes appears to have been equally boundless. His letters written after Durer's death are a torrent of invective, painting a portrait of a domestic hell that is almost operatic in its misery. He described Agnes as a grasping, avaricious shrew, a woman who gnawed into his heart and so tormented him that he was driven to the grave sooner. According to Pirkheimer, she was a relentless taskmaster, forcing Durer to work himself to exhaustion even when he was sick and frail, all for the sake of pinching every last penny. He accused her of being a miser, who sold off the magnificent horns of an elk Durer prized, a woman so devoid of spiritual or intellectual depth that she was a constant burden on the great artist's sensitive soul. In Pirkheimer's telling, Agnes was not a partner but a parasite, a shrew who destroyed the man he loved. Now we must proceed with caution. Pirkheimer was a man of his class and his time, and a thick vein of misogyny and patrician snobbery runs through his condemnations. He likely saw Agnes as a common woman, a merchant's daughter unworthy of his brilliant friend. His grief was raw, and it is a common human failing to seek a villain in the face of loss. Agnes, crucially, left no diary, no letters, no rebuttal. Her side of the story is a gaping silence in the historical record, drowned out by the thunder of Pirkheimer's accusations. She is a ghost shaped entirely by the words of her enemy. And yet, to dismiss Pirkheimer's account entirely would be a mistake. He was not a distant observer. He was in Durer's home, at his table, a witness to the daily texture of their lives for decades. His accusations are too specific, too passionate to be pure fabrication. They must have been rooted in something real, some observable friction that he, as Durer's closest confidant, would have seen and heard. The truth, as is so often the case, likely resides in the dreary, gray space between outright abuse and simple, profound incompatibility. Durer himself, ever conscious of his public image, was far more discreet. But the chill is there if you know where to look. His detailed diary of his journey to the Netherlands in 1520-21 is a remarkable document, a window into the life of a traveling celebrity. Agnes accompanied him on this trip, and her presence in the diary is almost exclusively that of a business agent. Page after page we read entries like, "My wife has sold the little passion for 4 florins. My wife has sold a woodcut passion for 5 white pennies. My wife lost at gaming 6 stivers." It reads like the logbook of a commercial enterprise, not the diary of a husband traveling with his beloved. There is a palpable lack of warmth, of shared experience, of simple affection. When he falls desperately ill during this trip, he makes a famous drawing of himself, nude to the waist, pointing with a gaunt finger to a spot on his abdomen. He captions it for his physician, "Where the yellow spot is, to which I point with my finger, there it hurts me." He is starkly alone in this image of suffering, a man cataloging his own decay. One cannot help but ask, where was Agnes? Even if she was a capable, if sharp-elbowed business manager, and the evidence suggests she was instrumental in the commercial success of the Durer workshop, was there no room for comfort, for a gentle hand, for the solace of a shared emotional life? Perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Durer marriage was not active cruelty, but a crushing, soul-destroying void. Consider the man. This was Albrecht Dürer, an artist of almost preternatural sensitivity, a thinker grappling with the monumental questions of faith, mortality, and the very nature of beauty. He was a man who craved intellectual communion, who thrived in the company of humanists like Pirkheimer and later Erasmus. It is not a great leap to imagine that he yearned for a partner who could meet him on this level, a true meeting of minds and spirits. What he appears to have found instead was a pragmatic, earthbound woman whose concerns were rooted in the material world. The workshop, the accounts, the price of prints. This was not a partnership of passion, but a partnership of production. We can speculate, not unfairly, on Agnes's perspective. Life with a genius is rarely easy. Durer was a man of moods, prone to the deep depressions he so masterfully captured as melancholy. He was a man obsessed with his status, acutely sensitive to slights and possessed of a towering ego. Perhaps her pragmatism was a necessary anchor to his soaring and often unstable temperament. Perhaps her focus on money was driven by a very real fear of the precariousness of an artist's life, a fear her husband clearly shared. Perhaps she was simply a woman of her time, fulfilling her role as she understood it, only to be vilified by her husband's high-minded friends, who saw her as an obstacle rather than a support. Theirs may have been the quiet tragedy of 2 people chained together by convention, speaking entirely different languages, living under the same roof but in entirely different worlds. For Durer, the man who could conjure entire worlds of emotion on a copper plate, his own home may have been the most emotionally barren landscape he knew. This was not a refuge from the world, but another source of the deep-seated anxiety that plagued his entire existence. This brings us to the second, and perhaps most surprising shadow in Durer's life, his relentless, suffocating anxiety about money. This fundamentally contradicts the image of the celebrated master, the prince of artists. He was, by any measure, a resounding success. His prints circulated across Europe from Spain to Poland, bringing him international fame. He received prestigious, if not always lucrative, commissions from the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. He was a respected citizen of the prosperous city of Nuremberg, a property owner and the head of a thriving workshop. He was a celebrity, mobbed in the streets of Antwerp, and sought out by the great and powerful. Yet his private writings reveal a man perpetually haunted by the specter of financial insecurity. His letters and diaries are littered with meticulous, almost obsessive accounting. He logged every transaction, every florin earned, every stiver spent. This was not just prudent bookkeeping, it feels compulsive, the work of a man who fears ruin is always just around the corner. When he traveled to Venice for the second time in 1505, he was at the height of his powers. Yet his letters to Pirkheimer are a litany of financial complaints. He felt undervalued and underpaid compared to his Italian counterparts, particularly Giovanni Bellini, whom he deeply admired. In a letter brimming with frustration and wounded pride, he writes the famous line, "How I shall freeze after this sun. Here I am a gentleman, at home, only a parasite." This single sentence is a key that unlocks his entire psychology. The complaint is not merely about money, it is about status. In Venice, the great painters were feted as luminaries, as gentlemen. Back in Nuremberg, despite his fame, he felt the lingering medieval perception of the artist as a mere craftsman, a parasite, dependent on the whims of patrons. His anxiety was not just about having enough to live on, it was about having enough to live up to his own conception of his worth. He was engaged in a lifelong battle to elevate the status of the artist from skilled laborer to intellectual nobleman, and he saw money and public recognition as the primary weapons in that fight. Every commission he felt was underpaid was not just a financial loss. It was a personal insult, a confirmation of his parasitic status. His relationship with Emperor Maximilian the Frere is the ultimate case study in this conflict. To be the court artist to the Holy Roman Emperor was the pinnacle of prestige. Durer designed magnificent, complex works for him, including the monumental Triumphal Arch, a gigantic woodcut print made of 195 separate blocks that was essentially a piece of imperial propaganda. It was an honor, but it was also a financial nightmare. Maximilian was chronically short of funds and notoriously slow to pay his debts. Durer spent years petitioning, writing letters, and chasing the annual pension of 100 florins the emperor had promised him. The promise was worth more than the payment, and Durer knew it. After Maximilian's death in 1519, this pension was in jeopardy. This is the primary, unglamorous reason for his great journey to the Netherlands in 1520. While art historians love to focus on the artistic fruits of this trip, his encounters with other artists, his exposure to new ideas, his powerful portrait drawings, the diary makes it painfully clear that the trip's main purpose was to get the new Emperor Charles V to ratify his pension. The entire journey was an extended lobbying effort. The diary becomes an almost painful record of his expenditures, his attempts to curry favor, and his anxiety about the outcome. He barters his precious prints for food, for lodging, for trinkets. "I gave the manservant of the treasurer of the emperor a Saint Jerome in the cell. I gave a Melancholia to the controller of the king's house. He is handing out masterpieces, the fruits of his genius like business cards, all in the desperate hope of securing a modest annual income." This is not the serene master, confident in his place in the world. This is a man in his 50s, the most famous artist of his age, still hustling, still worrying, still feeling the cold breath of the parasite on his neck. The sheer volume and relentless quality of his output was driven not just by a divine creative fire, but by the very mundane and human fear of the empty purse. That fear was compounded by a growing terror within his own body. Durer, the master of anatomical rendering, the man who depicted the human form with such unflinching realism, was forced to live in a body that was failing him. The illness that took hold in his later years, very likely a chronic form of malaria, became a tyrannical companion. It is believed he contracted it during a bizarre and ill-fated trip in 1520. While in Zealand, he heard that a massive whale had beached itself on the coast. Driven by his insatiable scientific and artistic curiosity, Durer rushed to see it, traveling through the swampy, mosquito-infested marshes. He never got to see the whale. The tide had washed it away, but he seems to have brought back a malady that would plague him for the rest of his life. He suffered from debilitating fevers, chills, exhaustion, and an enlarged spleen, the very organ he points to in his famous drawing. In the 16th century, such chronic intermittent illnesses were a mystery, an imbalance of the humors that could lead not just to physical decay, but to profound spiritual despair. The Renaissance had a potent word for this condition: melancholy, and Durer's exploration of it would become one of his defining legacies. His 1514 engraving, Melancholia Forntre, is arguably the most complex and enigmatic image of the entire Renaissance, and it is impossible to view it as anything other than a profound spiritual self-portrait. Here is the embodiment of the intellectual's despair. A winged female figure, the personification of genius, sits slumped in frustrated inertia. Her head rests heavily in her hand, her gaze lost in the middle distance, a picture of creative paralysis. All around her are the tools of art and science, the very instruments of human achievement, rendered useless by her immobilizing gloom. There is a compass in her hand, but she does not measure. A plane lies discarded at her feet. A sphere and a complex polyhedron, symbols of geometry and universal order, sit inertly. A scrawny, underfed dog sleeps fitfully, and a brooding poodle scribbles meaninglessly on a slate. Above, a bat-like creature carries a banner with the title, "And a comet," a traditional omen of disaster, blazes across a twilight sky. The only hint of order is the magic square on the wall, where the numbers in every row, column, and diagonal add up to 34, a small island of rational certainty in a sea of despair. This is not merely an allegory. This is a diagnosis. It is the portrait of a mind that has reached the limits of its own knowledge and found only emptiness. It is the artist's block, the scholar's doubt, the terrifying moment when inspiration fails and the tools of one's craft become a mockery. For Durer, a man suffering from a chronic, draining illness, a man beset by financial worries and trapped in a cold marriage, this state of intellectual paralysis must have been a recurring personal horror. The engraving is a testament to his honesty. He did not merely depict heroes and saints. He depicted his own demons with the same meticulous, unforgiving detail. He showed the world the dark side of genius, the crushing weight of a mind that sees too much and feels too deeply. This internal struggle is thrown into even sharper relief when we place Melancholia the Myrrh alongside its companion piece from the same period, Night, Death, and the Devil. Here we see the opposite pole of human experience, the life of action, of unwavering faith. A Christian knight, encased in shining armor, rides steadfastly through a dark and menacing gorge. He is the embodiment of the vita activa, active life, just as Melancholia represents the vita contemplativa, contemplative life. The knight is utterly focused, his gaze fixed forward, ignoring the horrors that surround him, and those horrors are legion. At his side rides Death, a decaying, crowned corpse on a pale horse, holding up an hourglass to mark the knight's fleeting time on earth. Behind him lurks a grotesque pig-snouted devil, a creature of pure nightmare, yet the knight is unmoved. His resolve is absolute. His faith, his armor. These two prints are a diptych of Dürer's own psyche. In Melancholia Pharaoh, we see the man he feared he was, paralyzed, depressed, lost in the labyrinth of his own mind. In Night, Death, and the Devil, we see the man he desperately aspired to be, resolute, steadfast, armored by faith against the terrors of the world and the frailties of the flesh. The tension between these two states, the paralysis of thought and the resolve of action, was the central conflict of his inner life. He was both the brooding genius and the steadfast knight, and his art became the battlefield on which these two sides of his nature fought for dominion. Of course, such a monumental internal conflict requires a monumental ego to contain it. This brings us to the final and perhaps most uncomfortable of Dürer's dark secrets, his towering vanity and his relentless, conscious self-fashioning. Let us not mince words. Albrecht Dürer was possessed of a pride that was tectonic in scale. He was one of the first artists in history to be so profoundly aware of his own historical significance and to take such deliberate steps to secure his legacy. His series of self-portraits are not merely exercises in self-observation. They are a calculated campaign of self-glorification. The sequence is breathtaking in its escalating ambition. The silver point drawing he made at age 13 is a stunning display of prodigious talent, but it is still a boy's study. The 1493 portrait, now in the Louvre, shows him as a foppish young man holding a sprig of sea holly, a symbol of marital fidelity, likely made to be sent to his prospective bride, Agnes. He is already self-aware, already curating his image as a sensitive and serious suitor. Then comes the 1498 portrait, painted after his first trip to Italy, and now in the Prado. The transformation is dramatic. Here is Durer the gentleman, dressed in lavish, striped finery, his hair meticulously curled, his expression one of worldly confidence. He poses before an open window looking out onto a distant landscape, a format borrowed from Italian portraiture. This is a declaration of his success, his worldliness, his arrival on the international stage. But it is the 1500 self-portrait, now in Munich's Alte Pinakothek, that remains his most audacious and controversial statement. Here, all pretense of casualness is abandoned. Durer, aged 28, presents himself in a rigidly frontal, hieratic pose, a pose traditionally and almost exclusively reserved for depictions of Christ, particularly in the Salvator Mundi, Savior of the World tradition. The composition is starkly symmetrical. His right hand is raised, not quite in a gesture of benediction, but close enough to be deeply evocative, gently touching the luxurious fur collar of his coat. His long, flowing brown hair and short-trimmed beard deliberately invoke the conventional iconography of Jesus Christ. The background is a dark, indeterminate void, pushing his illuminated face directly into our space. To the right of his head, he places his famous AD monogram and an inscription in Latin. I, Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg, portrayed myself in everlasting colors, aged 28 years. What are we to make of this? Is it an act of supreme piety or of blasphemous arrogance? The most generous interpretation, and one that holds considerable weight, is that Durer was acting within the theological concept of imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ. For a deeply religious man, the act of artistic creation, of making something beautiful out of inert matter, could be seen as a reflection of God's own divine act of creation. In portraying himself in the guise of Christ, Durer may have been making a profound statement about the divine nature of artistic genius. Claiming that the artist is a vessel for God's creative power, he was elevating his profession, and himself, to a spiritual plane, but we cannot ignore the sheer breathtaking pride of the act. The inscription's mention of everlasting colors, the placement of his own monogram as a seal of divine approval, the unflinching self-possessed gaze, it all points to a man who saw himself not just as a creator, but as a creator. He was consciously crafting his own icon, forging an image for the ages. He was not just painting a portrait, he was asserting his own immortality. This was a man who saved everything. His early drawings, his master's studies, his notes, his letters. He was his own archivist, curating the material for his own legend. The AD monogram itself was more than a signature. It was a brand, a logo he defended fiercely, even taking a Bolognese artist to court in a landmark case over copyright infringement. This was not the humble medieval craftsman, toiling in anonymity for the glory of God. This was a thoroughly modern man, a brilliant marketer and a fierce protector of his own intellectual and commercial property. A man who believed his genius entitled him to a place beside kings and perhaps even beside God. So, who was Albrecht Dürer when the studio doors were closed and the admiring crowds had dispersed? He was a man of jarring contradictions. He was the celebrated gentleman of Venice, who felt like a parasite in his own home. He was the head of a prosperous enterprise who was haunted by paroxysms of financial anxiety. He was the husband in a long, stable marriage that was likely an emotional desert. He was the great intellectual, the master of order and proportion, who was tormented by the chaos of melancholy and the decay of his own body. He was the pious Christian who dared to paint himself in the image of his Savior. He was, in short, a man. To see him in this light, to acknowledge the shadows he would have wanted to keep hidden, does not tarnish the legacy. It completes it. The greatness of Dürer lies not in some mythical, effortless perfection. It lies in the fact that he produced works of transcendent beauty, rigor, and emotional depth despite his demons and perhaps because of them. The tension between his pride and his anxiety, between his faith and his despair, between the sublime order he sought and the messy reality he lived. This is the furnace in which his genius was forged. His art is not a placid reflection of a perfect life. It is a testament to a titanic struggle. He wrestled with his own darkness and, with his pen and his burin, transformed it into an immortal light that continues to illuminate the most profound corners of our own shared humanity. The man he would have hidden from you is the very reason we cannot and should not ever look away.